Welcome to the third Hawaii Tableau user group meeting that we've had. We had the first one last July, the second one in October, and this is the third one. We have the honor today of having guest speaker Sam Epley come and speak with us. Sam is an analytics consultant in Minnesota, and he has been using Tableau since March 2020. As an active member of the Data Fam, he co-leads the Twin Cities Tableau user group, was recently featured as a Tableau public featured author, and as a Tableau desktop certified data analyst and professional. He started using Tableau public to improve his skills and develop a data visualization portfolio. And his work is often featured in the Sports Viz Sunday Weekly Roundups, and 3 of his Vizes have also been selected by Tableau Public as Viz of the Day. Outside of Tableau Public, he spends his time with wife and 3 children and serves in the Minnesota Army National Guard. He enjoys watching sports, reading, and listening to music. I'll turn it over to you, Sam.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what the proper terminology is over on that side of the world. I'm based out of the Twin Cities, as Dana had mentioned. Is it aloha? Is that the proper terminology, Dana?
Yes, aloha is to say hello aloha to everyone. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to jump in here and share about my dashboard design process. A little bit about an agenda here. So Dana had already covered a couple of the different points here, but I'm going to share a little bit about me and my background, and then I'm going to go and do an overview of what my dashboard design process is. Then I'm going to, we're actually going to walk through an example with a Makeover Monday exercise. So for example, as I was preparing this presentation several months ago, I wanted to make sure that I was kind of approaching this with fresh eyes. And I wanted to take several of the lessons that I was going to be teaching on and actually apply those with a data set that I had never seen with or worked with before. So we're going to be walking through the American Time Use Survey by the United States Department of Labor Statistics. It's Makeover Monday 2019, week 23. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit here. And then I'm going to share about my favorite Tableau resources and really what's allowed me to grow and learn as I've been able to do over the course of the last 2 years. So, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, and we can spend as much time as the attendees here want to spend asking and answering questions. I'm always happy to take time. So a little bit about me. Dana had already mentioned a couple of these things, but I live just west of the Minneapolis metro in a small town called Hopkins. Married and father of 3 kids. In the upper right-hand corner of my screen, you can see 2 of my kids. My daughter, who at the time was probably about 5 months old, we had just bought a house, and she was sleeping in her car seat. And one of the very valuable lessons I've learned over the course of being a parent is if you have a sleeping child, don't wake them unless it's absolutely necessary. So we let her sleep, and when we took that picture, but. I serve in the Minnesota Army National Guard. I'm in the process right now of going through training and education to become a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I've been in consulting in some way, shape, or form since 2016, and have been Tableau focused or almost Tableau exclusive in analytics consulting since March 2020. Incredibly, very heavily involved in the Tableau community. As of a couple of days ago, I surpassed 380 Tableau public visualizations, and that's all been over the last 2 years. January 2022, Tableau public featured author. They just released a brand new cohort, 10 wonderful ladies from around the world. I would encourage you, if you haven't done so already, go ahead and check out some of their work. It's really, really cool. And give them a follow on Tableau public if you have a profile. If you don't have a profile, I would recommend just logging in. It's completely free. And go ahead and giving them a follow. So recognized 3 times Tableau Public Viz of the Day. Have a slew of different Tableau desktop certifications, certified professional, associate, data analyst, and partner consultant, which is a certified associate consultant. And then I regularly participate in Workout Wednesday, Back to Viz Basics, Sports Viz Sunday, and Makeover Monday. So at a very high level, I'm going to walk through what my Tableau and dashboard design process is, and just some of the, I'm going to touch on it at a very high level here, and then I'm going to go into each step a little bit deeper. But really, at a very high level, the first thing that I've learned is most important is that you have to make sure that you understand who your audience is. You have to understand the types of questions that they're going to be using this dashboard to answer. Because I've been guilty of this in the past, where I've just built a dashboard and added a bunch of cool bells and whistles, and have built something that I think looks really, really cool. But if I haven't involved the end user, or I haven't involved the audience, or tried to understand what questions do they need answers to, and it doesn't answer what they're looking for, then it won't be well adopted. And it'll kind of fall to the wayside, because if someone already has a bunch of different processes that they use that allow them to get the answers, and they can trust that process, and your solution doesn't offer anything new or anything that adds value, then it's hard to change people's habits. But if you can meet with them and understand their needs, then you're able to develop a solution that's more effective than the current processes that they already have in place. Second most important step is to gather data and ensuring that it's trustworthy. Doing what you can to make sure that you understand what is the data, what is one row of this data mean, and are there specific nuances to it. Next, now that you know what the audience needs and you know what your data is, then you're able to explore that data. And as you're exploring that data, you're trying to identify story points or valuable things that could be communicated. And that's usually driven by understanding what your audience needs, so that you can craft insights that help them make their decisions more quickly. Next, once you've identified a couple of insights, then you have to evaluate what's the best way to communicate these. And this kind of blends with the fifth point here, but making sure that you're leveraging data visualization best practices, and that you're not potentially misleading your audience, or having a non-optimal chart type, which then that chart type could misinform or mislead or set someone down the wrong path. So we want to make sure that we're using the right type of chart to communicate the insight we're intending to communicate, and then making sure that we're adhering to best practices as closely as we can. Then, basically through this process, we know what our audience needs, we know what our data is, we've been able to identify insights, we've been able to build the right types of charts and keep the charts effective and clean. Then we have to put them together on a dashboard. And with the dashboard, what we're trying to figure out is a bunch of different things pertaining to spacing, pertaining to user kind of interactivity, things along those lines. And then lastly, there's kind of two different paths that I'll talk through: an internal and an external type of way of sharing. And with this, this is kind of the process as a whole, and let's dig into it a little bit more deeply. So the first step is understanding your audience. And what's important to recognize is you have to think about who is going to be using the dashboard. What are the things that they care about? If you're meeting with an executive, for instance, and their key initiatives relate to, let's say, the percentage of units at the store that are being returned, and the amount of revenue that's generated, and the product mix or market share growth. Understanding what it is that they care about and how they're incentivized potentially can be really valuable in terms of crafting the story that you can tell that helps them know how they're doing overall as an organization. So think about the types of decisions that they need to make, because the types of decisions that they need to make, that will influence the level of granularity that you need to display on a visualization. It'll influence the specific messaging that you're trying to communicate. So also think about how are they going to be interacting with this. And this kind of plays to the last bullet point about the type of device, but there have been dashboards that I've built for clients where it's the end product has lived on like a television in kind of a common area. And people go past that and updates occasionally, and it gives them an insight for how are we doing today, or a week to date, or month to date, or year to date. And if you have something like that, where if it's just on a monitor and there's no ability to play with it with a mouse or keys or a touch screen or anything like that, if you can't interact with it, then if you understand that's the nature of it, then you won't build in a bunch of cool interactivity. However, if you understand that, for instance, to my left, I have a 32-inch TV that acts as a monitor at my desk. And if I'm building something that fits this ginormous canvas, but I come to find out that the end user, they are going all over the place. In the case of Hawaii, they're going around the island, potentially going to some of the other islands to potentially do business meetings, and they might not always have a 32-inch monitor that they can take with them. They might be relegated to a laptop, or maybe a phone or a tablet. So understanding what is the type of interface that how are they going to consume this data. So after we've gone through this step, and this isn't just something that we can just like look at somebody and know that, ooh, that person needs to know this. It's a matter of having a conversation, facilitating a conversation with the end user in order to glean these insights and learn the lessons that then you can apply to the dashboard once you have an opportunity to explore the data and start to make some design decisions. So next, gathering data. And we want to make sure that we're leveraging data sources that are trustworthy. The worst possible thing I think that can happen when it comes to data is it's not vetted and it's not certified, and we don't know if it's accurate. Because if you're trying to make data-driven decisions and ensure that you're taking the right course of action, it's important to have good information. And as you're trying to take information that you trust, then you can take that and analyze that information so that you can then make good, well-informed decisions. So when it comes to what your data means, thinking about like, what does each individual row stand for? Is it an invoice? Is it a customer service call? Is it in real estate, is it a property, or is it a hotel reservation, for instance? So understanding what each line of the data means and recognizing if there is a column that has a bunch of small integers between 1 and 10, do those actually mean numbers, or are those keys for some other table? So recognizing and understanding what is the data model that will go and support a visualization, recognize what your data can do, recognize how you can connect it with other things that can supplement and add value to your data and to your data model, and make sure that if data dictionaries exist, that you leverage those, because those can be incredibly helpful resources. And make sure that the columns that you're using them as the data engineer or the data team or whoever put together the data. Make sure that you're using it the way that it was intended, because there's been a handful of times where I thought I had the right field when it came to, like, let's say revenue, and it turns out that there was a different field that was the right field. So at making sure that you understand which fields in your data represent what and what you're trying to visualize, that's really important. So the last component here, making sure that you're properly citing your sources and having kind of a series of breadcrumbs, as it were, for where are you getting your data from and how can you know that it's trustworthy. There's been a handful of times over the course of my career where I've sat in a meeting and you have two VPs kind of at each other's throats, because one has one source of data that says that the number is this, and another person has the number somewhere else, and they're arguing about which number is right. And if you're able to have a good, clear process for ensuring that your data is trustworthy, and you have an opportunity in your visualization to put a comment or to have a hover over tooltip or something that will explain this is where this data source comes from. If there's any manipulations or modifications that happen to the data, then ensuring that you clarify what those are. That way you come into a meeting with a dashboard that has all of this information. And if there's any sort of contention that comes around that data, then you're able to point to and say, this is exactly how we processed it. This is how we've come to this kind of curated, centralized, single point of truth with respect to data, so that you're able to make the most informed decision. And the more clarity and transparency that you can provide to your end users, the greater confidence that they're going to have that the data is trustworthy and correct. Moving on, so we know what our audience needs and we have good, trustworthy data. Now what we get to do is we get to identify insights. So this is really the exploratory phase of the exploratory and kind of starting phase of developing visualizations. And what I'll do, and I'll show this here in a little bit when we go through the specific example, but what I'm doing when I'm trying to explore insights is I'm trying to take all of these different fields and I'll try and see, are there certain trends over time? So like, for instance, in the example that I'm going to show later today, with the time use survey, it ranges from 2003 to 2017. So there's a good amount of data in there for a pretty wide period of time. And being able to see, is there any significant change? If you have more granular data, if anyone here is familiar with the Superstore data set that comes standard with Tableau Desktop, and I think Tableau Public as well, it comes packaged with the tool. If you look at overall sales and revenue over time, one thing that you'll notice is that sales peaks in Q4. And that's pretty consistent through all 4 years of data that come with the data source. Now, if you know that sales are going to be higher in Q3 and Q4 than they are in Q1 and Q2, that can inform certain business decisions. And you're able to speak to the seasonality component to this. Also exploring different patterns or correlations. So if you have, let's say you're looking at a product level and you're trying to see is there a relationship between the profit rate and the average selling price? And if you have a really, really high selling price, does that mean that you have a really high profit? Or does that mean potentially that you're losing money and you're not selling things for as highly as you could? So evaluating relationships between variables can be really important, and that can uncover a lot of really valuable insights. Next, thinking about dimensional groups. So within Superstore, for instance, there are several different categorical groups, and these groups would be like region or state or the customer segment or the product category. Like the product category, you've got technology, you've got office supplies, and you've got furniture. And if you're trying to understand, what's the average selling price or what's the average number of items in a market basket, anytime that someone checks out of the Superstore, that is potentially valuable information that if that correlates to what the audience needs, then you can surface that as an insight. So be exploring values by dimensional groups. The last point here, this kind of ties to the previous point, thinking through is our data trustworthy? And if you're encountering anomalies or outliers, then that's a good opportunity to explore whether or not the data is accurate. Because if if your average sales volume on a monthly basis is, let's say $50,000, let's just say that's what it is. And then all of a sudden you get a new data point, and the data point is 6 million in one day. That could be accurate. It could be completely accurate, but that should inspire some inspiration to talk to the data team and say, hey, I see this number. This is way out of what is normal. Is this correct or is this wrong? Is this like a test row that got passed in that didn't get stripped out when the production data workflow took place? And that can ensure that you're accurately reporting information. And if you can confirm that the data is accurate, then what you can do is you can use that as a story point of saying, this has been our trajectory, and we had this really, really strong month or this really strong day with this brand new customer who came in and they bought a lot of stuff. So you can surface that based off of anomalies or outliers, and just ensuring that does the data reflect reality. So being conscientious of that. So by this point in time, we know what our audience needs. We have data that we can trust. We've started to explore and been able to identify a couple of insights and stories that we could be telling. Next, what we can do is we evaluate, we have different things that we can tell. We have to evaluate what's the proper way to tell that story. So based off of those insights, we have to think about what's the most appropriate chart type that's going to communicate our message most effectively in a way that's not going to mislead our user. So when it comes to like values by dimension, so the example I used with like the region or product category or customer segment, if we're using bar charts, for instance, to communicate certain values, bar charts can be really effective for both positive and negative values. If you're trying to show like a proportion of the total, let's say with a tree map, which a tree map is basically a big square or rectangle and then it's broken down into the different segments, and it's really helpful for showing hierarchical data. So the caveat to tree maps, for instance, in a case where you would not want to use it, is if you're trying to show if the size of the area was, let's say, profit, and you had a negative profit value, a tree map can't clearly communicate a negative value. So that's something to take into consideration when you're choosing your charts. In that case, if you knew you had negatives, you wouldn't want to use a tree map. Thinking about values over time. So this is where you'll see like a line chart or an area chart or a bar chart. If you know folks who work in the construction industry or construction management, Gantt charts are really popular because you can see different stages of processes or tasks and when they're going to be completed. And if you have dependencies on other items, that way, in a project management situation, if you know that you've got 3 other items that have to be done before a certain action can take place, and those are not done, then that's a barrier, and that pushes back a timeline, for instance. So that's a clear way to communicate with time. When it comes to geographical data, generally maps are a pretty good way of doing that. Within Tableau, there are several different ways that you can do that. You have your circle maps, you have filled maps, and then you have custom polygon or shape maps, like if you're using a hex map. Hex maps can be really useful if you're trying to see certain values, not necessarily sized by state, but if you're trying to get like a ratio, for instance, by state, it allows you to see things more clearly, because in the northeastern United States, you've got a bunch of those smaller states. Washington, D.C. is super tiny. But then if you think about like land area, Rhode Island is considerably smaller than Alaska. So being thoughtful of how you're mapping your data in a way that doesn't skew things or misrepresent things. Then with comparison, so let's say, for instance, that you are trying to compare your current month sales against the quota for the month or a target. What you can do is use a bullet chart, or a bullet chart. What that does is it has your current value, and then it has either a reference line or background shading behind it. And what that shading allows you to do is it allows you to see something, a certain value compared against either a goal or just an overall target. So bullet charts can be really helpful when you're trying to compare data. Distribution of values, that's where you can have different items like a histogram or a density plot or a box and whisker plot. And when it comes to those types of things, all you're trying to identify is there a certain concentration of values, and are they equally distributed across the entire data set, or are there a bimodal distribution where there's 2 really prominent peaks? So we'll see that a little bit with the data later here in a little bit. And then proportion of total. So kind of like tree map, but slightly different. I like to call this section the baked goods chart section because you've got bars, pies, and donuts. And I am a fan of all 3 of those things. However, if you think about it from the perspective of visualizing data, if you have a significant number of points or marks that are being shown, let's say that you've got 100 products, and if you have any more than 5 items within a pie chart or a donut chart, it can be very hard for your user to consume that. So now I'm not suggesting that we cut all of our pies and donuts into 100 pieces in real life, but if we're doing it effectively and we're choosing how to communicate it with our data in terms of a proportion of total, if you've got like 2 or 3 different categories, it can be an effective way of communicating. So next, by this point in time, we've got our data, we know what our people need, we've got some good ways of communicating using the right chart types. Next, we're moving on to some best practices. So to the last point, making sure that you're using an appropriate and effective chart type that helps communicate your message. Making sure that you're not misleading your user. So an example that I like to use, so I don't really know how tall my daughter is because she's not standing yet. But let's say that, I'm about 6 feet tall, my wife's about 5'6", and my oldest son, he's maybe like 3'3", and my middle child, he's, let's say, 3 feet tall. And if we use a bar chart of height, what we'll see is that I'm the tallest, my wife's next, and then about half of my size, we have my 2 kids, my 2 boys. And let's say, for instance, that makes sense if the bar starts at 0, if that's where my axis starts. Let's say that, just for the sake of making the data more compact, we say that, oh, let's start our axis at 3 feet tall. Then all of a sudden, my wife and I look like giants, and we've got these really, really small children. And what allows a bar chart to be effective is that you're actually encoding a value with respect to length, and our brain associates that. So in the example of a non-standard bar chart that starts at 3, then you would see a 3'3" tall child, and they would be 3 inches above the axis. And then, I would be essentially I'd look 12 times as tall as my oldest son in that example. So make sure that when you use bar charts, for instance, that you're starting it at 0. I have seen very little use case for anything that does not start at 0. So just be conscientious of that. Another example of how data could be manipulated or improperly displayed would be if you had a reversed axis. So let's say that we've got like ice cream sales over time, and we've got shark attacks over time. And let's say that in reality, they're both, they're positively correlated and they're both going up over time. But let's say that because I'm trying to be manipulative, I reverse the shark attack axis and say, oh, look, all this ice cream is going up, and oh, all the shark attacks are going down. That would, if we didn't properly label it, or we didn't have a good reason for flipping that axis, then we could be misleading our user. So some things to be considering as you're going about displaying data in a certain way. Next, making sure that we're leveraging pre-attentive attributes. So a pre-attentive attribute are our brains, for the most part, when we see data visualization, it's triggering the visual receptive sections of the brain. If we see like a table in Excel, it's triggering the text processing sections of our brain. And that might not allow us to necessarily see the insights that we're trying to communicate. And I've got an example that I could pull up from my Tableau public that I think would probably tell this pretty well. It's just having a really big text table, and what's the value of that? It's not saying that text tables can't be valuable, but if you can leverage pre-attentive attributes to tell a story and to communicate clearly and effectively, it can allow you to be really successful with data communication, data storytelling. And then gestalt principles are pretty similar to pre-attentive attributes. I won't go into all of them here, but I would encourage you to Google that. There's several different ones with respect to, I think, color, proximity, enclosure. I think that the book Makeover Monday by Andy Kriebel and Eva Murray, and then also Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaum and Affleck, she gets into what the gestalt principles are and how to leverage them to effectively communicate data. So I'll leave that there. But next, so we've got well-designed charts, our story is making sense. Now what we have to do is we have to put all of these different components together on a dashboard. So if we've got well-designed charts, we need to be thinking about how we have them arranged on our dashboard. And I don't exactly remember where I've heard this, but it might be Practical Tableau by Ryan Sleeper, I think is where I heard this. Or the most number of like chart components that you'd ever want on a dashboard is maybe 12. And when it comes to that, if you overload your user with like 50 different charts and you don't have very clear guidance for how they need to consume this data, they can get lost and confused, and kind of their eyes aren't drawn to specific logical progressive things as they go about consuming a dashboard. So be very thoughtful about how you lay things out. Try to potentially build in interactivity if the use case is appropriate for that. So like the example with the monitor, if they can't touch it, they can't interact with it, then don't build it in because it doesn't make sense. But provide your user with direction and instruction if it needs to be there, so that they can see it and it's boxed off and it's enclosed and it's, oh, this section means this and this is what it does, and click this to do this. If you can provide your user with some really valuable insights, it can be really, really helpful. So I would encourage you to leverage text and leverage color to draw people's attention to certain things so that they can most effectively interpret what you're trying to communicate. And I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about the user path. So whenever I'm working through a dashboard, whether it be for fun, for Tableau Public, or for work for a client, What I'm trying to evaluate as I'm going through a dashboard design process is when someone comes to a dashboard, it's not because they like looking at a pretty picture necessarily, or a pretty dashboard. They're generally coming here to this dashboard to get information and to be able to make decisions. So if we've done a good job on the front end of understanding our audience, then we know from a general sense, what are the things that they care about? They care, situational awareness. They want to know what's happening. Are things good? Are things bad? Are they headed in the right direction, or do we need to improve some things? So getting a general overview of what's going on, just providing them with some very quick insight, and then taking a next step from there. And if you can diagnose that something is not how it needs to be, then you try and dive into, okay, why is this happening, or where is this happening? What is causing this variance or discrepancy in our expectations? And once you're able to kind of pinpoint and target that, then what you can do is, and this is usually where a lot of the dashboards that I've seen people create, is that they just let them know that, this is going on and this is where the problem exists. What you can do to make your dashboard really effective is be able to have specific call to actions directly embedded into your workbook that can basically pitch up call to actions directly to the user. So if that means that you have a URL action, and let's say just hypothetically, you had some KPIs at the top that communicate high level metrics, and then you have a breakdown by like region and customer segment. And if someone wants to explore a specific segment because they see that something's weird, then they get it down to like the invoice level. And then if you see that, oh, this invoice to John Doe, we sold them $50,000 worth of products and we lost $40,000 on this sale. What's up with that? Then what you can do is you can click on a button and potentially even just like send an email or send a screenshot of that to whoever's responsible, so that you can circle back with them and get a better sense for, okay, what happened here and why is this the way that it is? Is there a mistake? Is there something going on that we need to be paying attention to? So think about what you can do in order to take corrective action. And last but not least, sharing our work. So sharing is a phenomenal way to be able to get the information back to your end user or the audience. So if you're doing something that's internal or that's client facing, where it needs to be private information in there, and we want to make sure that that's there's governance that is in play for that, so that the right people are seeing what they need to see and the wrong people aren't able to see it. In most cases, what a lot of companies do is they'll leverage either Tableau Server or Tableau Online. And Tableau Server is it's hosted generally internally by a company, but then or it's potentially hosted on a cloud. But Tableau Online is something that is run and maintained by Tableau. It's basically a server administered. It's a server as a service, basically. So for a lot of different companies, it's a great option because you don't have to worry about the updates, and things are for the most part, you have as much control as you need in order to implement the different things you need to implement. So when you're looking to potentially share this information externally, or it's public facing data and it doesn't need to necessarily have governance tied to it, an option that I would encourage you to consider is potentially publishing it to Tableau Public. Because if your goal is to get views and to get exposure and to get this in the hands of as many people as possible, then publishing it onto Tableau Public is a great location for that. And there's more than 2 million authors around the world. It was this last year that they hit that. And there's hundreds of thousands of visualizations that are out there. And it is a phenomenal place for getting inspiration for whether that be design related thing or functionality related thing. If you don't have a Tableau Public, again, I would recommend it's free, signing up for it, and subscribing to Visit the Day is a great way to get kind of started if you're just new to it. So with that, let's jump to the Makeover Monday from week 23 of 2019. And the data set came from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it was basically a summary of the average number of hours of sleep per day, broken out by year, by age group, by sex, and by type of day. And what I mean by type of day, on like the weekends or on holidays, you're gonna have different sleep behavior than you will on a normal weekday. So those are kind of the different ways of slicing this data. And this is the original chart. So what we see here is a bar chart where the y-axis starts at 7 instead of 0. And the example that I used earlier about the heights of my children is really relevant here, because let's say, for instance, this blue bar here between 15 and 19 and has a value of 9.8 hours per day for men of that age group. If we are looking at this, oh, well, the lowest one is men aged 45 to 54. And if we didn't have labels here that were directly on the bars, what we would see here is we'd say, oh man, that bar is, goodness, these youngins between the age of 15 and 19 are getting twice as much sleep, because in bar charts, the length of the bar encodes the value. You're like, man, they're getting twice as much sleep as this demographic. You'd be like, oh, they got 8 hours of sleep, they must get 16. But that would be misrepresenting the data. So it's important as we're designing our chart to be thoughtful of this. So let's be like Buddy the Elf and jump over to Tableau. So I'm going to open this here on Tableau Public, and let me refresh this. So it doesn't refresh on us unintentionally. So here's what the end state dashboard looks like. And there are really only 2 charts that I decided to use in order to communicate this data. So we have the average hours of sleep. This is a variation of a line chart called the slope chart, where we're just taking, in this case, the minimum year and the maximum year. And we're looking at what is the overall change over the course of this period. And what we can see is that, there are some that go up and there are some that go down. Some go up by, like for instance, men 15 to 24 slept an average of just over 10 hours, whereas men 15 to 24, they got basically an extra maybe 20 or 30 minutes of sleep, somewhere in that ballpark, on weekend days and holidays. So thinking about, okay, there's a little bit of growth there. There are some demographics where we go down. But one thing I want to call out here is the use of text. So I have a very clear header that describes Americans sleep in on the weekends, because that is when we jump into the actual dashboard itself and the different analyses that I did, that's an insight that you'll be able to see. But telling a little bit of a contextual story, most Americans fail to get that much sleep on a nightly basis. This is the survey, so telling a little bit about the data, where it comes from, and then telling a little bit about the data. So those over the age of 65, they're the most consistent sleepers, and no one in that demographic is measured as sleeping below 8.5 hours or above 9.5 hours. So it's all concentrated right here. And all other age groups sleep fewer hours on the weekdays and catch up on the weekends and holidays. And females between 2003 and 2017, females and those between the ages of 15 and 24 made the most improvement, but these changes are not significant. So we have a little bit of interactivity here with different segments of the population. So if we want to focus in on the demographic 15 to 24, what we see here is we got these 2 different groups, which is interesting. Or what if we don't want to focus on age? Let's say that we just want to focus on and see weekend days and holidays and being able to highlight those. And we can see pretty much everything is near the top there, and it's also near the top here. So with that, giving some instruction on this and telling about, this is what you expect to see. It's the average hours of sleep, 2003 to 2017, hover to learn more. And we, just like we saw there. And then the distribution of measurements in hours of sleep. So basically what I've done here is I've got one histogram layered on top of the other one. So with this, what we see is for, if I get rid of this here, what we'll see is we have the overall distribution of the population. So most people are saying they get 8 or just shy of 9 or 9, somewhere around 9 hours of sleep. And what's valuable about this is that we can say that of all of the measurements throughout the entirety of the data, 20% of those measurements, someone said they got 9 to 9.25 hours of sleep. But let's say that we jump back in and show weekdays. What we'll see here is not only does it skew to the right, and it takes pretty much all of these different segments, but 35% of this purple region slept 9 to 9.25 hours. So we've got basically a proportion of the total and a proportion of the cohort. So, and then here at the bottom, talking about I designed it, this is what it is, and then making sure that I reference the data and the people that put it together. So with that, I'm going to jump over to Tableau, and I'm going to show some of the different charts that I went through to try and explore what's a good way to communicate this data. So first here, we have a bunch of spaghetti noodles. We've got a bunch of lines. And what we see here is, okay, we've got basically every measurement point from 2003 all the way up to 2017. And we might be thinking, well, this is really messy and hard to read and hard to interpret. So maybe this might not be the best way of communicating the insights of change over time. Plus, there's not a whole lot of variation here. I think the most variation we have is somewhere in the ballpark of maybe an hour total over the course of this. So we don't see anything that goes dramatically up or drops off dramatically. Probably the biggest change was this one of men between the age of 15 to 24 going from 9.9 up to 10.65, but it came back down a little bit. How about this? So this is a jittered density like scatter plot, basically, where I'm breaking it out by dimension. So here, what we can see, and this goes into the conclusion that people sleep more on the weekends and on holidays than they do during the non-holiday weekdays, because we have, it's all concentrated right here compared to this all concentrated over here. And I've got some set functionality baked into this that the group that I've got chosen is those 65 and older. And what we see is that those 65 and older, they sleep probably the most consistent of all of these groups. And that's an insight that we can look to communicate. What if we look at it by gender? Here it's labeled as sex. What we see is that men maybe sleep a little bit less over here than women, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of variation with respect to that. How about by age group? This is the moneymaker here. This is the big valuable insight. So what we saw earlier on was that those above the age of 65, they all for the most part, they slept a pretty consistent type group. What we see here is that this is all of the weekdays, and we see this pattern here of as they age, they're getting less sleep. And then on the weekdays, they're also getting less sleep. So we have this big variation here, and then it tightens up as people get older. And if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. If you think about folks over the age of 65, they probably have a higher propensity of retiring. And if you don't have to work a job, you don't have to necessarily get up as early. So you're most likely not going to be going out or staying up as late because you don't have those specific types of things that you're concerned about. So you're able to get more consistent sleep. So that's a valuable insight there. Similar to the line chart, similar chart, but not really valuable insights from that. So we won't use that. And then we think about the histogram that I described a little bit earlier and the types of insights that that can potentially provide us with. So then we have a slope chart, which is just basically a line chart with all of the middle parts snipped out. And then we have our histogram measurements, and this is the one that's on the dashboard. So, and always thinking about different ways that we can build in functionality with tooltips and encouraging people to interact with this and say, what if we look at this from the perspective of what about women? Do women get, they might get a little bit more sleep, but it's not as dramatic as the other group was. So with that, I'm going to jump back to my presentation here. Give me a second. Okay. So I want to share a little bit about my favorite resources with respect to Tableau. So how I learned Tableau 2 years ago is I bought an e-learning license, which if you think about it, I think they bill it annually, and that's $120 a year. That is worth its weight in gold. And if you don't have that, or your employer is not willing to do that, and you're looking to skill up with Tableau, I'd highly recommend considering getting a license to the Tableau e-learning. And I'll send Dana the slide deck here. All of these links are live, and I maintain these. So if you're looking to learn Tableau, I'd encourage you to explore e-learning as an option. The Tableau knowledge base, Tableau does a really good job of documenting their tool and providing the Tableau forums are super, super helpful for if you're trying to learn or work through an issue or something along those lines. I'd encourage you to check that out. Getting plugged into a local Tableau user group. So I don't know the geographical where everyone is who's on this meeting, but you're at the Honolulu Tableau user group. So you're plugged in, and that's awesome. You're learning, you're growing, you're having an opportunity to network and connect with others. So props for you for being here. And I always encourage people to get involved in the Tableau community because it's a great way to learn and to network and to learn learn, network, and spend time and make friends with people who interact with these types of tools. Next, attending Tableau conference virtually or in person. So Tableau conference this year is in Las Vegas between May 17th and May 19th. As far as I know, tickets are still available, but I would encourage you, if you haven't had an opportunity to go and you have the opportunity at your fingertips to go, I'd encourage you to consider it, because it's, in years past, pre-COVID, it had been 15 to 20,000 people who love the tool of Tableau and the interface and the community. My wife and I, for those, if there's anyone here who's going, my wife and I are going. We're going to take a week in Vegas and attend this, and she's excited to learn more. My wife is a stay-at-home mom and doesn't know anything about Tableau, so it's going to be all new for her. It's going to be a lot of fun. But if you can't go in person, it is virtually available and it is free. So they have, I think when they had the Tableau conference last November, it was somewhere in the ballpark of like 90 or 100 sessions. It was a lot of different sessions, all across different types of talks about functionality, about how to get involved, about how to learn, about developer related tools, pretty cool stuff. So if you have an opportunity, consider going. Following Tableau Visionaries, it's formerly known as the Tableau Zen Masters. They changed that this last, I think, January or February. But these are folks who have invested a considerable amount of time into the Tableau community. They write blogs. They're involved on the forums. They do YouTube channels. They contribute and they add a lot of value to the community. And that is kind of the recognition that they get for this. But I'd recommend following them on social media. And the best way that I found to do that is on Twitter. And you can follow the hashtag DataFam on Twitter. And that's a great way to get plugged in with people who are active in the Tableau community. Moving to the right side of the slide here, getting involved with Tableau Public community challenges. So Workout Wednesday, it's kind of a technical focus. And I'd say that Workout Wednesday by far is the best way to learn the tool of Tableau and to really stretch your understanding. Some challenges take 15 minutes, some take several hours. They really stretch your understanding of, how do I do this really complicated thing with level of detail calculations or table calcs or maps, map layers, or different ways of using the tool. And I can tell you that as a result of doing somewhere in the ballpark of like 220 of these Workout Wednesday challenges, I've been able to, I know how to tackle problems in a different way than a brand new user to Tableau, because I've had to kind of squeeze as much functionality out of Tableau as I can get, and that's allowed me to be more effective in my job. So if you're going to participate in any of these challenges, Workout Wednesday would be the one that I would recommend most. Back to Viz Basics, B2VB, recently started this year by Eric Balash out of DC, and the challenge with this is they'll provide you with a clean data set, and they'll say, okay, the target for this month or this week's challenge is to take this data and build an effective scatter plot. And it's focusing on just like one specific assignment, whether that be using maps, or that's bar charts or line charts or scatter plots or whatever. But it's a good way to kind of, if you're just getting started and you don't know much about the tool outside of Workout Wednesday, this is a fantastic way of learning and growing. Sports Fizz Sunday, I'm a big sports guy. I love sports, and Sports Fizz Sunday, they have a data set that they'll put out every month, and it allows you to figure out how do we go about communicating clearly with this data. It's a great way to learn, a great way to grow. Makeover Monday, it's no longer actively facilitated. It was run for a long time by Andy Kriebel and Eva Murray, and they've since kind of put it on pause. But if you go to the Makeover Monday website and you're just looking to try something out, they've got somewhere in the ballpark of about 300 different data sets that they've put together over the course of, I think it's 2014 to 2021. So would highly recommend jumping into that, because if you have a data set and you want to see how can I communicate this, it's a great way of exercising kind of that design muscle. And then a couple of books here, several of them that I've mentioned already, but some of these are Tableau specific, some of them are not. Storytelling with Data, it is what it says it is. Probably for someone who's tool agnostic and they're just trying to understand how do I learn how to tell stories with data, far and away one of the best books I think I've ever read. Big Book of Dashboards, that's by Steve Wexler, Jeff Schaefer, and Andy Cottergreave. This is not Tableau specific, but a lot of the visualizations that are built that are inside this book, it's like 30 different examples. If you're looking for design inspiration, would highly recommend Big Book of Dashboards as well as Makeover Monday by Andy and Eva. Highly recommend that book. And then 2 books by Ryan Sleeper. Practical Tableau is like a 100 different little miniature chapters about like different things that you can do with Tableau. And I read that book probably 2 or 3 months into my Tableau journey. And it taught me a lot of really useful tips and tricks that I would either learn later on in Workout Wednesday, but it allowed me to be a little bit more creative with my development. And then Innovative Tableau, if Practical Tableau is a 100 level course, Innovative Tableau is like a 200 or 300 level course. And it's another 100 items. So with that, has anybody got any questions? I don't see any in the chat right now. But would love to hear.
Yeah, we don't have any in the queue. So we don't have any Q&As yet, so nobody's asked any questions. But feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. And then also, if you wanted to ask a question, you can raise your hand. You could do that too, and we can allow you to talk. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask, and we'll give you a couple minutes.
Well, while we're waiting for the questions to get dropped in, if you want to follow me on social media or Tableau Public, I'll be sending this over to Dana here shortly, but you can follow me on Tableau Public. Just type my name, Sam Epley, LinkedIn, Sam Epley. On Twitter, it's Epley Samuel. And I'm not very active on Instagram, but if you want to, I'm there and I publish some data visualizations every once in a while. But,
awesome. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any hands being raised or anybody with questions. So I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of announcements. Just for the future, like on the horizon, we try to put on these meetings quarterly. So we should be having another meeting sometime here in the next 3 months. We may have someone from Tableau coming to join us, which would be exciting. And if that happens, we'll be sure to schedule our user group around him being out here. We are also thinking about putting on an Iron Viz, just a local one, small one, kind of competition. So that's an idea that we've been toying with for one of the future user group meetings as well. So, but I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. And thank you, Sam. Mahalo, Sam. Thank you for presenting. And normally we get you a lei or something, but we can't. Yeah.
Not today.
Yeah, not today. So, but thank you. And thank you for attending, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.